city of Ephesus was a commercial, political, and religious center of Western Asia, what's now modern day Turkey. Commercial, political, and religious city. Everything that was anything happened in that area. Busy, bustling, center of everything. The capital of Asia Minor is number 2, along with Alexandria and in Egypt and Antioch in Syria. Ephesus is one of the 3 most influential cities on the Mediterranean Sea. Roman Empire, the Mediterranean Sea area ports there back in those days. I just find Ephesus really interesting because we'll talk here in a few minutes about some of the archaeological stuff that happened. So they uncovered these things and how we can actually tie this city back in history through the archaeological digs, through the documents, through everything. And I just find it a little bit fascinating. The city of Ephesus was also the home of the temple of Diana, called Artemis by the Greeks, the Asian goddess of fertility. The Asian goddess of fertility. So you can imagine some of the things that were done to celebrate her, to worship her, to emphasize her. So that kind of leads you to the understanding of what kind of condition this city was in. There were three shrines and 2 temples built for her on the very same spot. When we build something like this that's not in God, you can see how it doesn't last. Because there were 3 shrines and 2 temples built for her in this very same spot. The last was so grand it was claimed to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. There's your blank there. One of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It said that the women of the city sold their jewelry to contribute to building this temple. Most everybody in the city had bought into this temple and this type of worship. Kings from all over had donated and given and contributed to this temple. The pillars of this temple, 6 feet wide, 40 some odd feet tall, they talked about how grand and amazing the construction of this temple was, to be one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. It's amazing that the world can put so much effort into something and it just doesn't last. No matter how hard they tried to build it, no matter how grand they tried to make it, no matter how expensive or just throwing money at stuff, just don't make it last. But that's what the world tried to do in building Diana's temple. It doesn't last. And I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself here, but we'll talk here in a few minutes about a foundation deposit or a cornerstone that they found during the archaeological digs. It's amazing that they threw so many jewels, gold, money, lives, men, time, and it just didn't last. The temple became very rich and powerful with those who worshiped there. The temple was most known for the image of Diana. They had images made. That was, we'll get to it in a minute. The number 5 there, a major industry of this city was manufacturing idols of the goddess Diana. That was one of the main money makers. Manufacturing of this city was making little bitty statues of her so people could worship her at home. So people could do this and that, and dust collectors. Those didn't last either. Paul labored in Ephesus for almost 3 years. Some accounts say just over 2, some say just under 3, but Paul labored in Ephesus about 3 years and laid the foundation of one of the strongest Christian churches of the 1st century. It had to be the strongest because look at what all he was up against. We just talked about the temples, that they just kept building. That temple to Diana was not a Christian church. That was a totally different form of worship that you see how much effort this city and the kings and the communities around them put into making this temple. But this was one of the strongest Christian churches of the first century. Paul's ministry, the next blank, was so effective that the magicians burned their books before all men. Let's take our Bibles and turn back to Acts, the book of Acts, chapter 19. And we'll have a few references in Acts. Acts chapter 19, verse 19. Let's look at that. And many of them also which used curious arts brought their books together and burned them before all men. And they counted the price of them and found it 50,000 pieces of silver. It meant a lot to these so-called magicians, right? When these magicians were found false, they couldn't recreate the things that God can do. They couldn't explain that in books, the things that God can do. They couldn't fool the people because God wasn't playing. God wasn't fooling people. What God did was the truth. What God did was real. And you can't reimagine that. You can't make that kind of stuff up because what God does is real. God's not here for a parlor trick. He's not here for a passing time. He's not here for our entertainment. What God does is real. And what God's doing in your life today is real. You can't recreate that by taking, a 6-month vacation. You can't recreate the things that God's doing in your life on a cruise. You can't recreate the things that God has done in your heart and in your life by some other feeling of utopia. You can't recreate that because what God's doing in your life is real. And He may be testing you right now. He may be trying you right now. It may be tough times right now. But what God does in our life, in our community, in everything around us is real and cannot be recreated by some fake magician. So the things in their books, they burn them. They couldn't do it. Where's that? The worship of Diana had been decreasing until a silversmith named Demetrius, there's your blank, there's a silversmith named Demetrius. Now this is a very important part of this ministry. The silversmith, making idols was his job, was his revenue source, started a riot against Paul. All right, we're still back in Acts 19. Let's read verses 23 through 41. Acts chapter 19, 23 through 41. And the same time there arose no small stir about the way. I'm sorry, I'm stuttering today. And at the same time there arose no small stir about the way, for a certain man named Demetrius, a silversmith, which had made silver shrines for Diana, brought no small gain into the craftsmen, whom he called together with the workmen of like occupation, and said, Sirs, ye know that by this craft we have our wealth. Wherefore, moreover, ye see and hear, and not alone at Ephesus, but almost throughout all of Asia, as Paul hath persuaded and turned away much people, saying that they be no gods, which are made with hands. So that not only this our craft is in danger to be set at naught, but also the temple of the great goddess Diana should be despised, and her magnificence should be destroyed, whom all Asia and the world worship. And when they heard these things, they were full of wrath and cried out, saying, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And the whole city was filled with confusion, and having caught Gaius and... I'm sorry, I'm terrible with names. My redneck slang does not let me pronounce some of these names. Aristarchus, men of Macedonia, Paul's companions in travel, they rushed with one accord into the theater. And when Paul would have entered in unto the people, the disciples suffered him not. And certain of the chief of Asia, which were his friends, sent unto him, desiring him that he would not adventure himself into the theater. Some therefore cried one thing, and some another, for the assembly was confused, and the more part knew not wherefore they were come together. And they drew Alexander out of the multitude, the Jews putting him forward. And Alexander beckoned with the hand, and would have made his defense unto the people, but when they knew that he was a Jew, all with one voice, about the space of 2 hours cried out, Great is Diana of the Ephesians. And when the town clerk had appeased the people, he said, Ye men of Ephesus, what man is there that knoweth not how that the city of Ephesus is a worshiper of the great goddess Diana, and of the image which fell down from Jupiter? Seeing then that these things cannot be spoken against, ye ought to be quiet, and to do nothing rashly, for ye have brought hither these men, which are neither robbers of churches nor blasphemers of your goddess. Wherefore, if Demetrius and the craftsmen which were with him have a matter against any man, the law is opened, and there are deputies. Let them implead one another. If ye inquire anything concerning other matters, it shall be determined in lawful assembly. For we are in danger of being called in question for this day's uproar, there being no cause whereby we may have account of this concourse. And when he had thus spoken, he dismissed the assembly. You see what's going on here? People are mad. People are mad because the preaching and the things that are being taught, the truth that's being taught, is going to cost them money. It's going to cost them money. It's going to cost them their livelihood. They put their money and their livelihood above everything. Because the truth was being preached, they were mad. They're not looking at the bottom line. They're not looking at the big picture. They're looking at their pocketbook. And a lot of times people today get mad because God's teachings, I'm at the risk of stepping on the toes of some prosperity gospel right now. God's teachings is not all about what you can make, what you will retire with on this earth, what kind of jewels, how good of clothes, what kind of car, how big a house. I've not read once in here that I'm going to be blessed with all the riches of this world. Not of this world. My retirement plan's laid up in heaven. My retirement plan is after I take my last breath here, I know that where I'm going to go. That's a retirement plan for a Christian. That's a retirement plan for a working Christian. These guys are mad, and they're bringing it up to the community as I'm speaking on behalf of the community. I'm speaking on behalf of all this group. No, Demetrius, you're speaking on behalf of yourself, because your livelihood, your money, the thing that you do for a living is at risk because somebody's preaching the truth. Those idols that you've made your living making are fake. And somebody's preaching the truth. He entices a riot, but Paul's convinced not to go and defend his people. I think if Paul had been there, it would have gotten violent. It would have escalated. Because Paul seemed to have a habit that most of us have. I think Paul would have found this, and I wouldn't put words in his mouth, but I think Paul would have found this as an opportunity to preach the truth, which was exactly what they were protesting and rioting. I commend Paul for standing up, knowing when to take advice, not to show up, when to go, when not to. I applaud that. But the truth of the matter is, they're mad because somebody stepped on their toes in their livelihood. They're mad because somebody told the community the truth. It's a good study in Acts, shows how the city leaders used law and order but also the threat of the Roman Empire to control or appease the people. We are at risk of being judged here today, guys. We're at risk of being, how do you say it here? We are in danger to be called in question for today's uproar. Somebody from the Roman Empire might find out that we don't have our stuff together. Somebody from the Roman Empire might find out that we had unrest in our city today, and they'll come in and remove us leaders, and they'll put more harsh leaders in their place. That's what I read into that. Because the Roman Empire didn't put up with any of this foolishness. You had something that wasn't working right, get rid of it. It's out. We're going to try something different. We're going to put somebody else in their place. So the leaders weren't trying to stand up exactly for what was true, but the laws were used that on this day helped protect the Christian people. On this day, it protected Paul and his followers. On this day, it pointed people towards a court of law instead of martial law. But it was all out of fear of what was going to happen to them too. You see how these cities react? Everybody that I've read about here in Acts today were just worried about themselves. Everybody in this city of Ephesus were just worried about themselves. The political leaders that had everything dismissed, they had everything dismissed so they wouldn't be replaced. Demetrius and his craft people were all mad because their livelihood was going away. They didn't have any real concern with the whole of Ephesus. It was his pocketbook that was going to be attacked, so it was him that brought all these people together. He come across as being, for the city of Ephesus, for all you guys. But the truth of the matter is, he got mad and he brought all you guys together because his pocketbook was the one taking the hit. I don't think he gave 2 counts. I don't think he gave 2 pennies, 2 pence, whatever monies that they used. I don't think he gave any reverence to the people around him other than, if I've got more people with me, I can make a bigger noise. I think that's what his goal was. I've got more people with me, I can have a louder voice. God has a great way of shutting those things down. The day the law protected the Christians has confronted the worship of Diana, the strongest idolatrous religion in Asia. You know, I'm sure Paul knew the gravity of the things he was taking on in Ephesus. I'm sure he felt the gravity, the importance every single day, he was there. But in these accounts right here, he lit the fire under, he confronted face to face the strongest idolatrous religion in all of that part of the world. Was taken on by that one church. A little more about Ephesus. There's some archaeological statements that I think are important before we actually get into the meat of what the letters said to them. As Christianity advanced, the worship of Diana declined. Her temple was plundered and burned by the Goths and finally deserted after the edict of Theodosius, which closed the pagan temples. The city decreased in size as a result of malaria, and the buildings became silted up with river mud and buried with the dust of the ages. That's what happens when something's not built on truth. That's exactly what happens when anything's not built on truth. If your house is not built on truth, this is going to happen. It's going to burn, it's going to get covered over, it's going to get dusty, it's going to get unused. Excavations began at Ephesus on May 2nd, 1863 by the British Museum under the direction of architect J.T. Wood. Continued until 1874, Wood's chief objective was to locate the Temple of Diana. He worked 6 years without avail. Then one day, while excavating in the theater, he uncovered the Roman inscription which told how the images of Diana were carried from the temple to the theater each birthday of that goddess. And it told the routing. So he was able to go to that part during the excavation and actually find the path that they took. The excavators found the walls of the city of Ephesus to be about 5 miles in length, enclosing all the area of more than 1,000 acres. Its walls were high and some of its streets paved with marble. You imagine that? Streets paved with marble. You know what? That street was not paved with gold. That street wasn't perfect. That street wasn't made, but it seems like they were trying to reach for something that they never could achieve. Can't achieve those things unless you're reaching for the truth. The most significant of these marble-paved streets led from the theater to the harbor, 1/2 mile away, 35 feet wide, flanked by colonnades behind which were shops and splendid buildings. Monumental gateways were at each end. The site of the temple Diana of the Ephesians was about a mile to the northwest of the city wall, was constructed of huge concrete platforms, 234 by 418 feet. This was found to be true in these archaeological digs. Pretty good sized building. While the temple itself measured 163 by 342 feet, its roof was supported by 127 ionic columns, 6 feet in diameter and 60 feet high. Sorry, I was off on my number. 60 feet high. Amazing feat of engineering. Guess what? It didn't last. Among the ruins, Wood found what he took to be an altar. This I found very interesting. But later, another excavator tapped on the altar and detected a hollow sound. When he broke it open and found a large and most significant collection of jewelry, coins, and other objects of art, many regard this as the foundation deposit or cornerstone collection, placed there when the temple was constructed. Now, we've studied cornerstones. We've studied who the cornerstone of our life is, the cornerstone of our building is. We've studied how a cornerstone sets all of our direction and sets all of our measurements and makes sure things are squared up, right? This is what they did to this temple, and now we read first what happened to it. You know, these temples and these shrines, they burned, they went away. The city declined, and buildings became silted up with river mud and buried with the dust of the ages. Malaria took over this town. Okay, you see what their cornerstone was made of? It was made of the riches, the jewelry, the money, the significant collection of jewelry, coins, and other objects of art. Many regard this as the foundation deposit or the cornerstone collection. That's what their cornerstone was made out of. That's why they didn't last. I think it's very important to understand. No, they didn't last, but all of this was power back in this time. All of this was prestige back in this time. All of this was the things that Paul had fought. And we talked about the trading. These miniatures, these gold, these silver, these craftsmen that were at risk. I just thought it was really important that you guys had a little bit bigger understanding of Ephesus. It wasn't just a small town, and this is one of the most excavated finds in history. And to me, it gave me a better understanding and a better appreciation of this first letter to the church. Because this first letter to the church says a lot. It says a lot, and it's got a remedy in it. It's got a way back in it. But it says a lot for as very few words as what's in it. And now, considering what I know about Ephesus and what has been proven to me by archaeological digs and what the Bible tells me about what happened there, it makes me appreciate it so much more that these letters were written. Let's go back to the book of Revelation. Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, these things saith he that holdeth 7 stars in his right hand, and who walketh amidst the 7 golden candlesticks. My notes here in my study Bible, first thing it says is, does God care about your church? Do you feel like God cares about your church? If you're tempted to doubt it, look more closely at these 7 letters. The Lord of the universe knew each of these churches and its precise situation. In each letter, Jesus tells John to write about specific people, places, and events. He knew every aspect of these churches. Every aspect. The stuff hidden, he knows. He praises believers for their success and tells them how to correct their failures. Just as Jesus cared for each of these churches, he cares for yours. He wants it to reach its greatest potential. Of course, God wants us to reach our greatest potential. He wants us to do the right thing for the right reasons. He wants us to do things for his reasons, not ours. He wants us to serve him for the things he needs done, not the things we personally want done. This is not on my resume. None of this should be on our resumes. God called me a long time ago, and finally he put his foot down, and I quit running at 45 years old. I could not run anymore. I have no doubt that if I would have kept running, he would have. But he called me. Not to put on my resume, not to be on a resume builder, but because he needed something done. And please don't take me as bragging, but you guys can do things that I can't do. But through my testimony and through some of the stupid things he let me live through, I think he's got a niche. I think he's got a need that, hey, you can go kick on that door when somebody else can't. But there's several people in here. Great to see you guys. You guys back there, you talk to people that I don't know. You can reach people that I don't know. And he's got a use for each and every one of us. The group of believers that you worship with and serve is God's vehicle for changing the world. That's the last note in this footnote down here. The group of believers that you worship with are God's vehicle for changing the world. Now, how are we going to change it? That can go either way. We like to think it's in a positive light. But we could very well make it a negative one. So the believers, our little group here, 20 or so of us in here, 22, 24 people that's in here, we are God's tools here on this earth. And we are what he's going to use to change the world around us, our little worlds. You have the influence to change each and everybody's little bitty world around you. Where are we at? Over a long period of time, the Ephesian church had refused to tolerate sin among its members. It wasn't easy in a city so full of immorality associated with the worship of Diana. We're also living in a time of widespread sin and immorality, but we don't call it that. We say personal choices or alternative lifestyles. Now, let me make myself extremely clear here, very clear. One, because I feel like that I should. Another, because we are being broadcast. God's not going to ask me about your sins when I get there. He's going to ask me about mine. But when I accept or tolerate somebody else's lifestyle, sinful sins, when I join them in that area, that becomes my sin too. We as Christians have to take a stand for what we believe, and we've accepted and accepted and accepted so many times. And I'm talking about the men's and the ladies' dress. The shirts get shorter, the skirts get higher, the boys have a different dress. What I tell my kids across the street is, raise your hands and touch your toes. If anything shows, change your clothes. That's a rule in Awana. Okay, we've had to ask somebody not to attend a service because of the way they were dressed. It's a distraction, and like I tell our young people, it's take a little bit of pride in yourself. Our young ladies, what they've heard from me more than one time is once you find a little boy, it's more important for him to see you smile than it is for him to touch your body. Then that might be somebody worthy of a little bit of your time. That might be somebody that's worthy of you hanging out with them. But you have to make that call. You have to discern that. The more we as Christians tolerate, the more that we're going to get pushed down on us. And we are meant to stand apart. We're meant to stand different. We're meant to stand up and stand out and do the right thing that Christ would have us to do. And to tolerate, to condone, to encourage that kind of behavior is just wrong. Now, with that being said, we don't hate the sinner, just the sin. I said in here a few weeks ago, you'll never look into the eyes of another human being that God doesn't love. Ever. Another living, breathing human being, you'll never look into the eyes of another person that God doesn't love. And there's no caveats to that. Love thy neighbor as thyself does not mean if they look like you, act like you, smell like you, have the money that you do, live in the same neighborhood. None of that matters. There's no caveats to that. He said, love thy neighbor as thyself. Not if they're the same color you are. Somebody else said a lot of Baptists are going to be really surprised one day when they get to heaven and Jesus is not a pasty white guy. He didn't come from that region. I can imagine in my heart's eye what Jesus may look like, but one day I know that I'll get to see the real him. And he'll get to see me. He sees the real me every day. But we got to stop letting things get in our way, our own personal feelings get in our way, and look closer to what God says in his Bible. Love thy neighbor as thyself. When a body of believers begins to accept or tolerate the views of the world, they run the risk of becoming the world and compromising the church's witness. That's huge. When we accept more and more things that walk through that door, it's all about the world and not about him, we run the risk of this church's witness being torn apart. Remember, God's approval is far more important than man's approval. Let's look at the things quickly that Christ commends the church at Ephesus for. Look at verses 2 and 3. I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience, and how thou canst not bear them which are evil. And thou hast tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and hast found them liars, and hast borne and hast patience, and for my name's sake hast labored and hast not fainted. The church of Ephesus worked hard. Number one, he commended them for working hard. Number two, for being patient. Number three, for resisting sin. Number four, critically examining the claims of false apostles. They were tried, they were tested. You said something, it had to be truth. And number five is hard. Suffering patiently without quitting. Some of us Christians, and I say us Christians, find it really hard sometimes to suffer patiently and quietly without walking away. That's hard to do. Because you're thinking, man, I don't need to take this kind of beating here. You're thinking, man, God's called me to do this, not to take that. You know what? If God's called you to anything, there's going to be some bruising, there's going to be some scars. There's going to be some feelings hurt. Every church should have its characteristics to spring from our love for Jesus Christ. These characteristics can't come from anywhere else except for love. Both Jesus and John stress brotherly love as the authentic proof of the gospel. That's the proof. If we're doing any of these things, if we're working, if we're resisting, if we're examining, if we're doing any of these things for our glory and not God's glory, that's wrong. It's the right thing for the right reasons. You can do the wrong thing for the right reasons, or the right thing for the wrong reasons, and it won't work. Look at the city of Ephesus, how grand and huge and protected and rich it was. And then look at its outcome, covered in silt and dust. All right, we'll start in verse 4 next week. Any questions or comments? Thanks for listening, guys.